Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Earth, Energy, and Environment E3 Conference and Exhibition. Thank you for joining us today on the second day of Earth, Energy, and Environment E3 Conference and Exhibition's third year 2023. I have the pleasure to be here with you this afternoon moderating this session, and I would like to start off by introducing myself. My name is Jomana Tarek Abdurazik. I have both my bachelor's and master's in petroleum engineering, and immediately after graduating with my master's degree and my experience as a research assistant at University of Houston Laboratories. By the end of our session, I trust you'll leave with an appreciation for energy and its usefulness. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded on your YouTube channel, PyPetro, where you can also find all of our previous and upcoming sessions in Earth, Energy, and Environment E3 Conference and Exhibition. On our YouTube channel, again, that's PyPetro. Please feel free to send your questions in the chat box and we will answer as many questions as possible. With that, I ask you to give your full attention to our invited speaker and help me in welcoming today's very honorable guest. Please welcome Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy. Hi, Chris. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad to have you on Earth, Energy, and Environment E3 Conference and Exhibition.
Hey, I am thrilled to be here, honored to be here, and excited to share some thoughts and remarks and then open the floor for questions, challenges. Don't be shy. I love the back and forth dialogue. All right, let me start with a little background. First of all, thank you for going to work or studying in the energy industry. It's hard to overstate how important energy is to the human condition. If you look at the history of the evolution of energy, it is entirely parallel with the history of the evolution of the human condition. There are no wealthy, low-energy societies, and there are no poor, high-energy societies. Energy just matters for everything we do. And to give a little context of that today, like I grew up in the United States and have lived my whole life. I've traveled to 55 nations, but I live in the United States. But today in the world, 8 billion citizens, we have about 5 billion today that are walking around in hand-washed clothes. That may sound like not that big of a deal, but the labor savings of a washing machine was just tremendous and transformational as it spread around society. Going a little bit further down the energy availability ladder, there's about 2 billion people today that either have no access to electricity or only intermittent access to low wattage electricity, meaning a few hours a day, enough to charge a cell phone and put a light on at night. That's way better than no electricity, but it's not enough electricity, not enough power to raise their productivity, their ability to earn more money, support, and bring more opportunity to their families. So the challenge of energy is very real and very broad. To me, the most alarming challenge, and I'm launching a foundation to address this problem, I'll talk about this at the end if I have time, but 2.5 billion people, roughly a third of humanity, cook their daily meals just the way all of our ancestors did only a few generations ago. They cooked their daily meals burning wood, dung, charcoal, agricultural waste, solid biomass inside their home or hut. This, according to the World Health Organization, kills about 3 million people every year. It's just a tragedy. It's a crisis. It shortens the lives, impedes the health, particularly of women and children, who in traditional societies are the ones that are gathering the fuel wood, that are over that fire, keeping that fire going. It's not just for cooking meals, of course. It's to keep heat at the night. Even in the tropics, it's cold in the evenings. So this energy poverty, this lack of having we turn on a stove at our house and when we're done, we turn it off. We don't live in smoke-filled houses or rooms, but so much of humanity does. We had about a little more than 3 million deaths a year in 2021 from COVID. We shut down the world for a similar amount of annual deaths. And I think mostly because it was wealthy people, meaning elderly people in wealthy countries that were the most visible victims of COVID. But 3 million people have been dying every year for decades simply because they don't have clean cooking fuel and a stove and are just living in much lower conditions than they should. So I'll come back to this at the end, but I think we have some giant challenges with just the availability, the affordability of energy that can better people's lives. I can tell my story real quick. Look, I learned at a young age that energy mattered. I was a science, math, sort of tech nerd guy as a kid. I was very into astronomy. I just couldn't believe I could see these stars that were hundreds of trillions of miles away. I could see them without binoculars, without anything. So my original fascination is, wow, that is one powerful candle. What's powering that? Well, fusion energy, a form of nuclear energy is the answer to that. You probably already know that. And when I was a kid in high school in the 80s, there was sort of a mania then that the world was ending, industrial civilization was going to roll over in a few decades. Oil and gas was the demons then as well, but the specifics of the story were different. And it was that we were running out of oil, gas, coal. We were running out of farmland and fertilizer and metals, sort of a depletionist belief then. Of course, it turned out to not be true, but how did I know that as a naive kid in high school? I ended up choosing to go to MIT specifically to work on fusion energy. We were running out of oil and gas and coal, and it meant our world was going to be imperiled within a few decades, well during my lifetime. I wanted to work on that problem. I worked on solar energy in graduate school at UC Berkeley. And soon after I left graduate school, I worked in geothermal, sort of a next generation geothermal energy, mostly in Japan, but other places as well. We called it hot, dry rock then. Now they call the same thing enhanced geothermal systems. So I say all this to say energy matters. I wanted to be in the energy industry my whole life. I don't care where energy comes from, as long as it's affordable, reliable, and betters people's lives. That's the only criterion that matter to me for energy. I work again today. My company, Liberty Energy, we own part of a small modular reactor company. I surveyed 6 or 7 of them, and we own a few percent of a company called Oklo that uses a fast neutron liquid metal cooled reactor. I think it's a fantastic design. It's 15 megawatts. It's dirt simple. It'll run 10 years between refueling. I am all for getting this approved and out in the marketplace as soon as we can. We also own a few percent of a company called Fervo Geothermal that's doing the same next generation geothermal I worked on 30 plus years ago, but now with shale technology, with long horizontal multi-frac stage wells, much better access to mine the heat of hot underground rocks. We are just beginning drilling right now. In fact, we've drilled 2 wells in what will ultimately be a 400 megawatt enhanced geothermal power plant in sort of west central Utah. Hot rock shallow there, already power purchase agreement signed. So I am all about different energy technologies. But truth be told, when I was born, the global energy system was dominated by hydrocarbons. When I went to college, the global energy system was dominated by hydrocarbons. As I talk to you today, the global energy system is dominated by hydrocarbons. And when I die, and I hope that's a long time away, I think it's quite likely the global energy system will still be dominated by hydrocarbons. That's not a political statement. It's not a desire. It's not a desire to protect business interests of me or anyone else. Again, I'm happy to be an entrepreneur in wherever energy works. It's just the advantages of hydrocarbons are simply tremendous. They're not explained well, they're not misunderstood, and they're not without side effects. Of course, there are downsides and trade-offs with any energy production technology. And I'll come back to that in a little bit as well. But in 30 years ago, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was formed, they had the Rio Convention, 1992. And there was sort of this first raising of the issue of climate change. It should be on the global agenda, and we should push towards an energy transition. And so there's been a lot of money invested, a lot of it in new technology and research and development is fantastic. A lot of it, I think, is not so fantastic. If you subsidize technologies that are expensive and resource and material intensive, I don't think we're moving the ball forward with that. But I am all for developing new energy sources. But let me talk about two words, two terms. I'll elaborate a little bit on them that we hear a lot about these days. And but I'm pretty outspoken critique of these terms. And the first one, in fact, I think it's even in the title of this conference, is energy transition. Again, heck, when I went to college, we talked about the energy transition. So that term's been around a long time. What I think is different now is a lot of people in society and many politicians and regulators believe we're in the middle of an energy transition. And if you're in the middle of transitioning, away from horse and buggies and to automobiles, well, you're going to invest less money in new stables for horses. That the people who are making saddles or whatever are going to go out of business. That was actually not super fast, but a relatively fast transition. But you make different decisions based on the fact that you're transitioning. And so I see and speak to many politicians, kind of middle of the road politicians, that are opposing the building of pipelines or export terminals, just basic infrastructure that's required to move hydrocarbons. Well, why would they be in favor of opposing that or go along with others that are highly motivated to oppose that? And I think the simple reason for many of them is, hey, if we're not going to be using it in 10 or 20 years, don't we have enough infrastructure already? Maybe that's not a problem. The problem with this term is it's just simply not true. We are not in the midst of an energy transition. 30 years ago, we got 87% of global energy from hydrocarbons. And today we get 83% of energy from hydrocarbons. So that's a 4% lower market share over 30 years, trillions of dollars of subsidies, mandates, impediments, a lot of will to try to push that energy transition. But at the current pace, it's 600 to 700 years to finish, a transition. To me, that's not a transition. And another way to say it is world demand for coal this year, record high. World demand for oil this year, record high. World demand for natural gas this year, record high. What's the fastest growing energy source on the planet over the last 10 years in terms of new energy added to the global energy system? By a fair margin, the fastest growing source of energy on the planet, natural gas. What's the second fastest growing energy source over that same 10-year period in additional energy supplied to better people's lives, empower them? Oil. So if we're transitioning away from oil and gas, they probably wouldn't be the fastest growing sources. Not in percentage terms, of course. If you provide a very small amount of energy, it's easy to have high percentages. As I said, I'm a big champion of nuclear, putting money and time and passion into that. Same thing with next generation geothermal. I'm not against new energy technologies. I'm all for them. But I'm also for realism and math and understanding what's actually happening in the world. I visited Washington, D.C. a couple times this year. I gave a talk to a crew of people in the House of Representatives, had a bunch of individual meetings with senators. I've gone twice, been pulled a little bit into this energy dialogue. I'm particularly keen to engage with anyone who has an impact in decisions around energy and infrastructure. I particularly appreciate to meet with and speak with people who have a very different perspective as I do, because those are the people I want to have that back and forth dialogue. I've learned a lot of things I believed. I've changed my views because other people have showed me data or convinced me I'm wrong or made me tweak my perspective. I think we only learn about things by engaging from people that have strong, informed opinions that are different than ours. There's nothing I like more than doing that. Unfortunately, I can't report a lot of great, thoughtful dialogues with politicians in Washington. And look, energy is complicated. And, politicians are not generally engineers. They're very rarely people that have ever worked in energy. So how could they learn a lot about energy? The other problem with that dialogue is energy's become so political. If you're in this party or this, set of views, well, you have to believe this about energy. And if you're in this views, you're supposed to believe this about energy. That's just, energy should not be political. It is not fundamentally a political issue. Energy is just the infrastructure that powers everything else in our world. I always say people, I think, misunderstand energy, and they look at its percent of our economy and they say, oh, it's just a sector of the economy. It's less than 10% of the economy. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. Energy isn't a sector of the economy. Energy is the sector of the economy that enables every other sector of the economy. You know, we can't build wind turbines or solar panels without copious amounts of hydrocarbons. We can't have modern medicine and internet, a vacation industry, art. We can't have what we have. Everything we have today runs on energy. And really at base, that energy we have today comes from hydrocarbons. As I said, it enables the building of solar panels or wind turbines or nuclear power plants or large-scale hydroelectric dams. And I elaborate on that a tiny bit. We think of energy, most everyone thinks of energy as the electricity sector. Oh my gosh, we're really changing our electricity sector. Change there is not as fast as you may think either. But globally, 20% of energy is delivered via electricity. 20%. If we could wrap the world in some magic material that generated electricity for free, we'd have covered 20% of global energy. But what about the other 80%? What about the other 80%? The most important use of energy, in my opinion, is making materials, making things. You know, to have an electricity sector, you've got to have steel and copper and plastic and telephone poles and giant generator stations, huge transmission lines that have giant cement bases, and then they're made out of steel, as I said, different metals, insulating materials. It's the manufacturing of those materials that's the biggest use. Almost 50% of global energy is used to make things. And the most critical source of energy in making things is process heat. You know, to make polysilicon, to make solar panels, you need heat well over 1,000 degrees, you know, to melt silicon and purify it. To make some metals, it's over 2,000 degree temperature process heat. We don't have a way today to do that with electricity. And I think it would never be efficient or viable to do that on large scale with electricity. So process heat today almost entirely comes from combustion. Combustion of natural gas, maybe most of all now. Cement is made massively from combustion of coal. Steel uses heat from either natural gas or coal, depending upon where you're producing it. It also needs a carbon source to put carbon into steel to make carbon steel. That carbon source generally comes from coking coal. So when we talk about, oh boy, Germany, they're getting 50%. I see headlines, more than 50% of their electricity from renewables. You know, they're halfway there. That sounds like an energy transition to me, at least in some of these wealthy countries. Peel back the layers and look more closely at where Germany is getting its energy today. About 20 some years ago, they started their energy transition, Energiewende, they call it. I can't speak with a German accent. They've spent somewhere between 500 billion and well over $1 trillion, depending upon how you count it, to transition their energy systems. Very rich, very modern, very sophisticated society. They wanted to be the vanguard of showing technologies, investments, societal commitment. They could change their reliance on hydrocarbons. The punchline there is 20 years ago, they got 80% of their total energy from hydrocarbons. And today, I'd love to hear what your guesses are. Today, they get 74% of their energy from hydrocarbons. So when you read those things, 50%, that's talking about electricity, which is one sliver of energy, not all of energy. And even when you hear the 50% number, it's when it's windy, they get a lot of their electricity from wind because they've got huge capacity in wind turbines. And particularly northern Germany and northern Europe in general is a very windy place. It's an awesome place to produce wind power. But even a lot of money, even in a great resource place, it hasn't been nearly as effective as people think. And in fact, I would say it's been downright destructive. German electricity prices, starting with that same start point of about the year 2000, German electricity prices are 6 times higher today than they were then. They have the most expensive electricity of any nation on earth. And Germany is a manufacturing powerhouse. They make stuff. They're most distinguished in making machine tools. They still are, by a fair margin, the greatest machine tool maker in the world. The US and China are much bigger manufacturing powerhouses than Germany, but a large percent of the equipment we use to make things in the United States and in China and in elsewhere were actually made in Germany. It's one of, together with the United Kingdom, they really began the Industrial Revolution. And they're more and more of their industry is leaving their country because it's not viable to make things anymore if you have energy that's very expensive compared to other places. The United Kingdom is sort of trodden. I just came from there. I was just at a conference in London, and they've trod down a similar pathway. Huge amount of wind power in England. I mean, enormous. They have that nameplate capacity of their wind is equal to their average electric generation consumption, about 80 gigawatts. So when the wind is blowing and the conditions are right, they're getting 50+% of their electricity from wind. But last December, they have things the Germans call Dunkelflatte, and it's just cold, dark, and windless. It's just weather patterns. That's what happens. United Kingdom had 4 or 5 days in December of last year where they got less than 5% of their electricity from wind. So what does that mean? You've got people on life support in hospitals. You've got factories running. You've got lights on in schools, manufacturing. Electricity, it's critically important that it's reliable, that it doesn't go on and off. You don't have blackouts. And so you really have to run 2 separate grids. The United Kingdom, just like Germany's biggest source of electricity by far is natural gas. In Germany, second is still coal today. It's not second in the United Kingdom anymore, but both of them get nearly half of their electricity from coal. They have a number of other sources, but they have to basically maintain 2 grids. And if you have a natural gas burning power plant and the wind kicks up, that wind power comes onto the thing, you've got to turn that natural gas plant on. But it's got to be there. It's got to be ready to turn on when the wind stops, or partially turn on when the wind slows down. So you end up operating a lot of assets less efficiently by turning them up and down. They don't last as long that way. They actually have higher emissions if you don't combust. The most efficient way to run a natural gas power plant, just like a jet turbine engine on a plane, is to run it at 80 or 90% of its output power at a flat, constant rate. And with electricity generation, that exhaust heat is recirculated to preheat inland gas called combined cycle to get very high thermal efficiencies. If you're moving them up and down or around, you lose a lot of these efficiency benefits. You lose a lot of the lifetime of this equipment. So it's turned out the efforts that have been sort of in the vanguard of energy transitioning, it's just tricky. The advantages of hydrocarbons are compelling. And my view is the message, coming back to my DC visit, my message to politicians in DC was, as we develop better energy technologies and they can pick up the slack, market forces will adopt those and we'll need less of these other energy sources. We should invest our resources in the most promising technologies. And honestly, there aren't a lot. Energy is hard. I do think nuclear is extremely promising, not only because it can't provide affordable electricity today, but that's really political and engineering problems that are solvable. Nuclear could be a low-cost source of energy, and not just electricity, but also process heat. So I'm all in on nuclear. I mentioned next-generation geothermal in the right areas. Doesn't have the same running room as nuclear, but it could be a meaningful part of energy, certainly in our country and in a number of other countries. So in any case, I'm for investing in those things, but when we're today opposing pipelines, opposing export terminals, slow granting or not granting permits on federal lands, what's the impact of that? none of that does anything to change the demand for oil and gas. We want our lights to turn on. We want our food affordable. The best and highest use of natural gas is to make nitrogen fertilizer. When you make natural gas more expensive, you make fertilizer more expensive, you make food more expensive. But you don't change people's demand for food, and we don't change people's demand for energy. So the net result of obstructionist policies is just to make oil and gas more expensive. And as I told the politicians, what does that mean to me? It means my company is at record profitability today. We will have by far and away our most profitable year ever this year. The oil and gas industry, US oil and gas industry as a whole, will have, if not record, maybe second most profitable year ever in the history of our industry. So hey, a little bit of restrictions of supply that pushes prices up. It's great for oil and gas people in the oil and gas business, but we're less than 0.5% of Americans. For the other 99.5% of Americans, we're just making energy more expensive, and we're chilling investments into our country. There's a lot of geopolitical interest these days to reshore in the United States. I'm sure you hear about that. Maybe we should build our semiconductors here. Maybe we should produce steel and rare earth mining and processing in the United States. To do those things, you need low-cost energy and a highly educated, productive workforce. Those are the two biggest inputs in where you site your plant, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Vietnam, whether it's in Kansas, or it's in California. What's the workforce like? What's the reliability and affordability of the energy source? But by restricting hydrocarbons or just impeding them a little bit, you're just raising the price. That doesn't speed an energy transition. It doesn't make other energy technologies suddenly become better. It's really just an overall reducing of opportunity in our society. Great for my business, but certainly my perspective is the goal of our business, we got to be better than our competitors, and I think we're going to do well whatever the business conditions are. I certainly don't want anything done at a government level or subsidy to help my business. Capitalism and competition work because businesses compete to provide better value to consumers, lower cost, higher quality. That's what drives increasing wealth. That's what's moved our world forward. I'm all for that. Don't do anything to help me. And I'm particularly adamant about don't do things to raise energy prices. 10% of Americans have received a utility disconnection notice in the last 12 months. Is it right to drive up electricity prices, drive up oil and gas prices, when for some people this is meaningfully changing the quality of their life? One last stat. In the European Union last year, there were 65,000 excess deaths last winter versus the previous winters. These excess deaths, there's always more people die in the winter because globally, 8 times more people die of the cold than die of the heat. So when the conditions are cold, you have higher mortality. But last winter, because of Europe's struggle with their energy policies, their dependence on Russian gas, they're shrinking their own oil and gas production. They had such high energy costs that so many people were unable to afford their homes to a safe temperature. And 65,000 people died last winter that wouldn't have died the winter before, when Europe still had higher energy prices than us, but not the elevated prices, because they made themselves so dependent on either weather-dependent energy sources and much bigger imports from an unstable, unfriendly country in Russia. Energy is too important to make political decisions. It needs to be done right. Let me end with a few comments about another word we hear a lot, or another expression we hear a lot about, climate crisis. Because what's the answer to, well, yeah, of course there's costs and there's things here, but we're facing a climate crisis. And that's why even if these things are painful, we have to do them. So what's the evidence for a climate crisis? And as kind of as I said, a sort of a science tech nerd guy, I've been studying and speaking on climate change for about 20 years now. A few quick points. Is the planet warming? Absolutely. Is a large part of that due to increased greenhouse gas emissions in the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, mainly carbon dioxide and methane, but also nitrous oxide and a few other greenhouse gases? Absolutely. the combustion of hydrocarbons has risen atmospheric content of carbon dioxide by about 50% from pre-industrial times. And it's rising. It's going to rise at 1.5 part per million this year. That absorbs infrared radiation. That leads to warming. So the planet warmed about 1 degree centigrade in the 20th century. And sea level rose by about 9 inches in the 20th century. And were we racked by destruction from these changes in the climate? I mean, the empirical data would say absolutely not. The 20th century was the greatest progress in the human condition ever. Well, what about, well, maybe it's going to be a lot worse this century. If you extrapolate the rate of sea level rise right now, and we have satellite data now, so we've got 30 plus years of pretty good sea level data. We're rising at about 15 inches a century rate right now. So we rose 9 inches in the 20th century. No one even knew about it. At the current rate, we rise 15 inches this century. Heck, maybe it accelerates, although no evidence of that. But if it did, what if it rose 18 or 24 inches this century? You know, that there's some infrastructure that would need to be built or whatever. But is that a giant global problem? And a careful look at it actually is it's not. We warmed 1 degree C in the 20th century. We're warming right now at the rate of 0.15 degrees C per decade. So we're sort of on pace to warm maybe 1.5 degrees this century. There are certainly people saying, oh, that positive feedback's going to kick in and maybe it's going to rise 2.5 degrees this century. Is that going to be a crisis for the planet? You know, the data, the science from the economists that study this problem, there's a whole economic section in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment reports. And their assessment is, if even at the higher end of warming, 4 degrees C of warming, the global economy per person at the end of this century would be reduced by about 3 or 4%. Those same models at current rates of economic growth, instead of people being 300 or 400% better off than they are today, you know, they might be 380% better off instead of 400% better off. And that's a loss. And in absolute dollars, that's trillions of dollars. That's not a plus by any stretch. But am I worried about my great-great-grandchildren being only, you know, 3.7 times wealthier than I am instead of 4 times? You know, that doesn't crack my list of worries nearly as much as 3 million people dying today because they don't have clean cook stoves. 60% of the people on the planet spending hours a day washing clothes because they don't have enough electricity to run a washing machine. They don't have the access to modern healthcare and medicine and the education and all the things that everyone on this Zoom call has. Those to me are urgent crises. And the only way these problems can be solved, it takes more than energy, but they cannot be solved without more energy. So my big message is the world needs more energy, better energy. Anything that moves us to less energy, more expensive, less reliable energy, that's not bettering human lives. I'll end with pointing you to 2 other things to find. So I write a report every year called Bettering Human Lives. And if you type in Liberty Energy, Bettering Human Lives, you can download it. It's about 100-page report full of pictures and data and words explaining energy. There's a section on climate change and climate economics, other challenges in the world, how materials are made. There's a lot on poverty and the roads out of poverty. In the next couple of weeks, I'll finish up the next version of Bettering Human Lives, which is expanded, but it won't come out till next year. It should be out in January. And the Reader's Digest Gen Z format of some of my big summary points is a little video I made. It's like 12 minutes long called Let's Be Honest. My whole thing is we can all have different visions of the future. We all should have different visions of the future because different things are important to people more than are important to others. So we all have different values and different trade-offs we want to make. But those visions, those trade-offs should be based upon fact and certainly are they consistent or believable given historical trends. So my goal, my wife got me a new license plate. Now I've never had a vanity plate in my life. And it's an abbreviation of energy sober. That is my goal. We should all be thoughtful people about energy. We should all understand the trade-offs. Yes, climate change is expected to have meaningful negative economic consequences going forward. And if we can invest $1 today and reduce climate damages by $2, $3, $4, fantastic. I'm all in for that. We have one Nobel Prize winning climate economist, William Nordhaus, and his work very in line with sort of the average of the IPCC's range of economists working on this problem. His analysis of net zero 2050 is that for every dollar we invest in the solution to decarbonize by 2050, gives 16 cents of benefits for reduced climate damages. So boy, that's basically for every dollar we invest, 84 cents is a human impoverishment program, and only small benefits. Where if we invest today in tuberculosis or malaria or education or gender equality in low-income nations, Bjorn Lomborg summarizes a lot of this in his latest book, Best Things First. We have opportunities to invest $1 and get $10, $20, $30 of benefit to human living conditions and quality of life. So to me, let's do the most important things first. Let's do the best things first. But in all of these scenarios, in all of these things, solving every problem, pursuing whatever your dreams are in life, energy matters. The quality, the affordability, definitely shrinking environmental impacts, all of those things matter a lot. Thank you for going into energy. And I'll stop talking now. Would love to hear any questions, comments, and please push back hard. If you disagree with anything I said, challenge me on it. Let's have a dialogue. Thank you all.
This was a great session. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. We have a few questions from the audience, if you don't mind answering them.
Yes, I love questions.
So one of the questions is how do we liberate the energy sector, if you will, from the political standpoint?
Wow, well, I've been working on that for 30 years. So obviously I do not know. I've been striking out. But I do believe that, look, so many things in life are political. It's not just energy. I just happen to be an energy nerd here. But to me, the best way to do it is to speak honestly and candidly. Too often our industry speaks in sort of carefully scripted talking points. They're only the positives and they don't acknowledge the negatives. Like nobody believes that. That's just ineffective. It makes us look insincere. Others in our industry, have pictures of windmills and solar panels and, and their net zero pledges. I think those are equally destructive. Net zero, by again, the own analysis is it's a human impoverishment program. We shouldn't stand for that. Wind and solar's impact so far has just been make electricity more expensive and less reliable. I'm not for that. We should speak with what we actually believe and in a candid way. I always lead off dialogues with politicians or at universities with what are the negatives? Do we emit greenhouse gas emissions? Absolutely. Do we emit pollutants? Absolutely. 15 years ago when fracking took off, did our industry attempt to hide what was actually in frac fluids? Yes, our industry did.
Right.
I can't imagine a more trust undermining thing to do. Don't worry, there's nothing bad that we're pumping under your house, but we're not going to tell you what it is. So, look, I think the road forward always in relationships, whether it's with the public or your partner or your friends or your business, is be honest and trustworthy. I do think in the end, energy sobriety will win. No matter what happens politically, the world will be run on hydrocarbons in the year 2050. That just technically, we don't have replacements for most of it. So that's going to happen. But a more sober policies means it'll be run on hydrocarbons that are lower cost, likely produced in cleaner fashions because the innovation will still be taking place. So there's different, but honesty and sobriety, I think, is the only way we can ever change someone's mind.
Thank you, Chris. Another question is, someone says they're noticing a shift to green energy and net zero. How long do you think this shift will be until we're we're fully operating on green?
Well, I'll first and look, I worked on solar energy, but I'll take issue with the term green energy. Green sounds like better for the environment, smaller impact. And look, I'm a mountain climber and a longtime board member of an environmental group called PERC, Property and Environment Research Center. We've been very impactful in saving fishing species, in large mammals in this country, and preserving wilderness in Africa. So look, I am passionate about real green, smaller impact on the environment. But first of all, wind and solar, I think they cap out below 10% of global energy. They only feed into the electricity sector. Their intermittent energy storage is expensive. So, today they're a little more than 3% of global energy. Might they get to 7, 8 to 10% of global energy in the next several decades? They might. I'm not sure I'd bet on that, though, because the economic impacts of that will be pretty negative. But they're never going to be, large suppliers of global energy because we can't make materials with them. We can't fly jets or giant ships. We can't mine. We can't do all the things we need for a modern world. But green, here's a quick summary of wind and solar. They take about 10 times more materials, cement, steel, metals, precision materials, 10 times as many materials to produce the same amount of energy as oil and gas does. We need cement and steel and all sorts of equipment to produce oil and gas from deep underground. The material intensity of wind and solar is about 10 times higher, and the land intensity is about 100 times higher, just far more land. So that the environmental pushback, even in the US, it's much harder today to permit a wind farm in the United States than it is to get a well permit. Well permits are harder than they were, but not as hard as permitting a wind farm, because you just impact a lot more people when you use a lot of land. And ultimately, your footprint on the planet is much larger when you're using 10 times as much materials per unit of energy. So in sort of a traditional environmental sense, I would say they're less green. Their physical impact on the surface of the earth is meaningfully larger. They do have lower greenhouse gas emissions, not zero, because they're very energy intensive to make those machines and operate those machines. But they do have 80 to 90% lower greenhouse gas emissions. Absolutely, if they could play a larger role in the energy system, they could contribute to lowering greenhouse gases. But my view, just because when I look what's technically possible, is 30, 40, 50 years from now, my hope is that nuclear is not a few percent of global energy that it is today. I hope it's a few tens of percent of global energy. You probably need 50 years for nuclear to get to 20 or 30% of global energy. But likely the long-term energy system, certainly in this century, is likely going to be dominated by hydrocarbons and hopefully emerging progress with nuclear, hopefully some additional contributions from geothermal. And of course, there'll be wind and solar in that mix and some other things as well. But the things you hear about, the oil and gas is going to be gone in 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, I think the chance of that is basically zero.
Well, that's great to hear for someone with a petroleum engineering background like myself. Thank you so much, Chris. Because when I hear the term green energy, it makes me feel like my career has come to an end.
It's a great marketing term, and people call carbon dioxide carbon pollution. Together with water vapor and oxygen, CO2 is one of the 3 most essential molecules for life on Earth. It is a greenhouse gas absorbing thing, so it has impacts. But calling it pollution is just another one of those great marketing terms for a cause, like green energy or dirty energy. They're disingenuous terms.
Chris, we published a paper last year where we looked at these issues, and we came up with similar conclusion to what you're talking about. I would be glad to send you a copy of the paper with the spreadsheet we used to do our calculations.
Oh, please do, Mohammed. And and for someone as smart and wise as Mohammed coming to similar conclusions, you bolstered my confidence. My wife would say it was already too high, but that's great to hear, Mohammed.
Thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation. It's really, really nice to hear all of that from you. I'm really impressed.
Thank you. I love this industry, and I'm so appreciative for the students on this call or whatever to spend their time, their life, whichever area of energy you go into, to work on these problems. That's how the world gets better, is advancement in energy. So, God bless you all for going this direction.
And congratulations on the award you got for Heart Energy.
Oh, thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming to talk to us.
Was my honor, an honor indeed.
So
Thank you.
hopefully we'll repeat this again next year.
Sounds great. I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care,
Chris.
everyone. Have a great day.
With this, we conclude our session, very enlightening session by Chris Wright, the CEO of Liberty Energy. It was a pleasure having you on Earth, Energy, and Environment Student Conference and Exhibition. Chris Wright, thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for tuning in with us this afternoon. Today's session will be uploaded on your YouTube channel, Pi Petro. Thanks again, and have a great day.